Hello, everybody. I'm Derek Arden, and welcome to Monday Night Live, my live and uncut podcast show. Tonight, I'm absolutely delighted to have Commander Charlotte Yemm with me, and I'm going to hand over to Patricia Fripp, who knows Commander very well indeed, to do the introduction. Over to you, Patricia.
You're about to hear the story of Commander Yemm's life of adventure. Her 30-year career in the British Navy has taken her from the Antarctica to New Zealand, from the Mediterranean to the coastal waters of the United Kingdom. She was the first female in the Royal Navy to command an operational warship, conducted counterterrorism patrols along the coast of Northern Ireland. She served in the Gulf at the end of the Second Gulf War, conducted counter-piracy off the coast of Somalia. At the UK Defence Academy, she taught UK and international senior military leaders and run the Royal Navy's Warfare Training School. Currently, she serves in NATO's High Readiness Headquarters, the Allied Rapid Response Corps. On April the 22nd, she assumes her promotion to Captain Royal Navy. She will return to the UK Defence Academy to run the Advanced Command and Staff course. Sit back and be amazed to discuss a life without limits. Please get those jazz hands ready and welcome Commander Charlie Yemm.
Over to you. Over to you, Commander.
Starboard 15, midships, steer 190, set both levers ahead 40. Navigator Captain, the ship is in hand, steering 190, both levers are set 40 ahead for 10 knots. You have the ship. It was the most exhilarating moment in my naval career. I handed my ship over to my navigating officer and I sat up in the captain's chair on board HMS Brecon. It was a crisp December morning and we were sailing on our first Northern Ireland patrol from our naval base in Faslane. I looked around at my team, taking a moment. I knew that they would be looking to me for command and leadership over the forthcoming patrols. But I was also very aware that the eyes of the wider Royal Navy and the media would also be watching to see how we performed, as I was the first female to command an operational warship. So how did I come from growing up at a time when women couldn't go to sea, to a moment where I had been selected for sea command on an equal footing as my male counterparts? I grew up in a small town in Dorset, a relatively normal upbringing. My father was an air traffic controller and my mother a school secretary. But one of the most defining moments in my growing up was our annual visits to the Royal Naval Air Station at Yeovilton, where we went to see the Air Days. As a 10-year-old girl, I can still remember being so impressed watching the sailors in their smart uniforms going about their business with enthusiasm in a professional manner to lay on the air show for all of us. I remember believing at that time, I want to be part of that team. I want a career in the Royal Navy. I wanted a career of adventure. I wanted to go and see the world at sea, see the world differently. I had big dreams, but what was most important was I needed people to believe in these dreams, particularly at a time when joining the Navy and going to sea wasn't an option for women. This was not a standard career structure. My parents spent many hours taking us around many of the recruiting offices to find out more about it and what we could do. My father recounts a story of when I was told in one recruiting officer, "But women don't go to sea." My response was, "Well, they will when I join." By the age of 17, I finally applied to join the Royal Navy. So you can imagine my excitement when a letter came through the post with Royal Navy stamped on the envelope. And I read it. "Dear Charlotte, thank you for your application to join the Royal Navy. We're inviting you to the Admiralty Interview Board, the Officers Selection Board. Now, the Admiralty Interview Board was a 3-day interview. It involved aptitude tests, interviews, leadership tasks, teamwork. They say that what they didn't know about you by the end of those 3 days probably wasn't worth knowing. In order to prepare for it, I had to learn a great deal about the Navy, but I also had to become up to speed on current affairs. Now, many of you will remember that at the end of 1989, the beginning of 1990, was a really unique moment in history, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so for me, listening to the Today radio program every morning was absolutely fascinating, tracking the changes across Eastern Europe, knowing that these would be so significant in our lives going forward. I attended my interview, and at the end of the 3 days, I was called forward to see the captain of the board to find out my results. And I was slightly apprehensive that the 2 candidates ahead of me had not been successful. But I went in, and the captain smiled and said, "Charlotte, many congratulations. You have passed your Admiralty Interview Board, but also with enough points to be sponsored with a bursary through university and have a place joining the Royal Navy on completion." Now, 1990 was not just a time of great change across Europe, but also within the Royal Navy. I had taken my interview in the January of 1990, and I was going to be an Operations Branch Wren officer. This was a non-seagoing role in the Women's Royal Naval Service. However, come the summer, I had a rather heart-stopping phone call from the Navy. "Charlotte, we regret to tell you that you can no longer join the Navy as an Operations Branch Wren officer." My heart stopped for a moment, but to my great relief, they carried on by saying, "You may be aware that women can now go to sea in the Navy, so the branch of warfare officer is now available to you." I was so excited, I leapt at the opportunity. This meant I would finally be able to join the Navy and go to sea and finally fulfill my childhood dreams. Next slide, please. I joined Britannia Royal Naval College in the January of 1994. As every military training establishment, it is there to make sure that we turn a group of civilians coming through the main gates into smart, shipshape officers who are ready to lead our sailors of the future. This involved a great deal of marching, learning about the Navy, leadership tasks, quite a lot of cleaning, learning how to wear our uniform and be in the right place at the right time, which in Navy speak means 5 minutes early for everything. After we finished our terms at Dartmouth, we then spent 8 weeks on board a Royal Naval warship. For me, we went to sea on board HMS Brazen, and we were officer cadets. This is quite a unique time in our training. We lived in the mess decks alongside the sailors, and we learned all about the different branches within the ship, all about their jobs. But equally importantly, we got to understand and know the sailors who in a fairly short space of time, we would be expected to lead. I have reflected back on the things I learned during that period on many times throughout my naval career. Next slide, please. After I finished my training, we then go to sea and learn our specialist skills. For me, as a warfare officer, I went to sea and learned a great deal about navigating, ship handling, and all of the roles of the officer on the bridge of a warship. As I've gone through my naval career, I have learned to develop my own leadership styles, and in doing so, I have looked to see how others have led. I have often taken some of the good points from those I have admired, and perhaps tried to avoid some of the points of those I have preferred to leave well enough alone. So, as a first job in the Navy, I was given a great deal of responsibility. From my first commanding officer, he had a great passion for training and mentoring his junior officers. I was given a lot of responsibility. I was given a great deal of hands-on time, manoeuvring the ship in close proximity of fishing vessels in the North Sea while we were conducting fishery protection. I remember, even as a junior officer, feeling that sense of empowerment and belonging, a part of that team, by being given so much trust and responsibility at an early age. So a little bit more about the role of a warfare officer. The first job of a warfare officer is to go to sea and become an officer of the watch. What this means is during our period of watch, we have charge of the ship. We are responsible for the safety of the ship, the crew, and all of the activity that goes on during the course of our watch, whether that's keeping the ship safe navigationally, whether that's doing launching and recovering of sea boats, running flying operations, gunnery serials, whatever is going on, that is our responsibility for the safety of the ship, as well as being the first responder to any ship's emergency. So as you can imagine, it is vital that the officer of the watch understands the role of everybody else on board. I learned at a very early stage that if I was doing high-speed manoeuvring on the bridge while the chefs were in the galley preparing food, I became a rather unpopular officer of the watch. Next slide, please. But not only did I need to understand what was going on in the galley, but also in the engine rooms. What was going on with the engineers? What were their checks and rounds that they were doing in order to provide us the right power when we demanded it from the bridge? Additionally, warfare ratings working on the upper deck, doing quite dangerous evolutions when we're coming to anchor, handling the berthing lines in and out of harbour. All of these require precise ship handling from the officer of the watch, so it is vital that we understand everybody's role. I believe that a ship is an excellent example of teamwork. Everybody's role on board the ship is vital. They all play a key part in the safe operation. When we deploy, we take all our experts with us. We sail with all of our engineers, with our logisticians. We take away with us all the spares we may need, the food we need. Being all in the same boat is absolutely apt. And it is vitally important that everybody feels that sense of empowerment and being part of the team for that ship to be the most operationally effective that it can be. Next slide, please. When I finished my training, my first job was as the gunnery officer on board HMS Dumbarton Castle. We initially conducted fishery protection duties around the coast of the UK and then sailed south to take over as the Falkland Islands guard ship. There are a couple of stories I'd like to recount from my time on board Dumbarton Castle. The first one, we sailed on the 27th of December, heading south via Rio down to the Falkland Islands. Now, as we came closer to the equator, it was getting increasingly warm, and it became apparent that the air conditioning system on board the ship didn't work. Not something we'd noticed when we'd been operating north of Scotland, but definitely something that mattered near the equator. The ship became so hot inside that the work done inside the ship was down to a minimum. In fact, the whole ship's company slept at night on the upper deck to keep them cool. It was the officer of the watch who had responsibility for tracking those equatorial rain showers on radar and making sure that the ship's company were woken up in time so that they prevented them from getting wet. Sleeping on the upper deck in the middle of the Atlantic where there is no ambient light is one of the most incredible experiences I had. The stars above us were countless. It was an incredible experience. I was conducting my ocean navigation certificate at that time. You may be interested to know the Navy still trains its warfare officers to navigate by the stars. And what this meant was I would take a fix from the stars in the morning. I would refine that position throughout the day using the sun, and then a fix in the evening from the evening stars. And we do this across an ocean transit until we make landfall on the other side. I remember one morning, it would have been about 5 o'clock in the morning, waking up under the stars, grabbing my sextant, taking my morning star sights, and thinking how I was so like many generations of mariners before, sleeping on the upper deck and navigating my ship by the stars. An incredible experience. You will be pleased to know that when we got alongside in Rio, the spare part for the air conditioning unit arrived, and our amazing engineers fitted it just in time for us to sail south to the Falkland Islands winter, where it would be turned off and not turned on again until the ship returned north some years later. Next slide, please. The military, and in particular the Navy, is an excellent example of through-life learning. Whether we join as a rating or as an officer, we join at the bottom of the ladder and we continue to train as we move through our career. One of the early training courses I did was to be the navigating officer. I was fortunate enough to navigate 3 different ships. The navigating officer is the pilot of the ship. I was responsible for drawing up the navigation charts, but also for executing the navigation in and out of harbour, go into anchorages, or any area of confined space where the navigation would be dangerous. But I was also responsible for training and mentoring my junior warfare officers. And this is something that I've always enjoyed throughout my career. And I remember reflecting back to how I had been trained and the responsibilities I had been given at an early age. And I tried my best to emulate that, as I knew how much I had benefited from it. I remember one story. I had a 2-year exchange job in New Zealand. I navigated their hydrographic survey ship, HMS Resolution. And it was a summer's day, a Saturday morning, beautiful weather, and we were sailing into Sydney Harbour. As you can imagine, every small boat in Sydney was on the water that morning. And my captain reflected that you could probably have walked from one side of the harbour to the other and kept your feet dry. There were that many boats. And it was my responsibility as the navigator to navigate the ship safely, keeping it within the safe navigation channels whilst manoeuvring between this melee of shipping. You can imagine my relief as we approached Sydney Harbour Bridge and turned left and came alongside safely in their naval base in Garden Island. Next slide, please. Another course that I did early in my career was I trained to be a hydrographic surveyor and a meteorologist. And the pictures you can see on the screen, the bottom right, the red hull, that's HMS Endurance, and I was a weather forecaster on there. This was in the South Atlantic, and back in 2000, we didn't have access to the computer-generated information that we do these days. Back then, I had to hand draw my charts based on a few observations across the whole of the Southern Ocean. So weather forecasting for our 2 embarked helicopters was quite a challenge, and there was a lot of time looking out the window and doing a lot more nowcasting as well as forecasting. The other ships you can see, HMS Roebuck on the left, coastal survey work around the UK, HMS Herald, which is in the top right. Now the picture in the middle, this is down the Corinth Canal. When I had left university, I went interrailing, and I went over on the train tracks that you can see in the photo. And I remember looking down into that canal and thinking how amazing it was. I never dreamt that I would have the privilege of navigating a ship through that canal, and it was one of the most exciting experiences in my navigation time. Now, the Hydrographic Surveyor is responsible for updating navigation charts. And when I was in New Zealand, I remember we were updating some charts, and one small cove hadn't been updated since it was first surveyed by Captain Cook. But the key part from a hydrographic surveyor is to find those uncharted hazards to navigation, those uncharted rocks, before another ship can. We have a saying in the Navy that any ship can be a survey ship once. Next slide, please. It was on my return from my 2 years in New Zealand that I took command of HMS Brecon. HMS Brecon was one of 3 Northern Ireland patrol ships, and our responsibility was part of the layered defence for counterterrorism. We conducted boarding operations searching for any potential explosives that could be smuggled across to mainland UK. At the time, that threat was still very real. Next slide, please. In order to do this, I had my Royal Navy Ships Company, and in addition, I had a Royal Marines boarding team, as well as an explosive search dog and army dog handler. You can see a picture of one of our explosive search dogs, a spaniel, particularly popular with the ship's company. He used to like to sit outside the galley and beg for sausages and was invariably well rewarded. As the captain, it was my responsibility to analyse the intelligence coming into the ship, decide which vessels needed boarding, and make sure that all the boarding operations and other activity within the ship was conducted safely. I have often been asked what the hardest part of being in command was, and I would reflect that when operations are running smoothly, everybody has bright ideas, everybody has an opinion on how things should be done. But when operations become trickier, the weather conditions become out of limits, there are problems with the boarding operation. That is when all the bright ideas go quiet and everybody turns to look at you. In those moments, I knew that I had to have a clear plan, and I had to make sure that everybody on board knew their role within that plan to keep us all safe. It was in those times when it goes quiet and all eyes turn to you that I really understood what it meant to be in command. One part of my command that was unique was, as I was the first female to command an operational warship, the Royal Navy didn't want this to go quietly. They wanted to make the most of the publicity, quite rightly. So I think I had my 5 minutes of fame. I was interviewed by every newspaper. I had been on TV, particularly in Scotland, where we were based. I was interviewed on Women's Hour, and I was also very privileged to be invited to Buckingham Palace to meet the Queen and senior royals. I was asked on many occasions what it was like to be the first female in this role, and I always said it was a huge privilege, but I would be the first of many. And I'm delighted to say that over the subsequent 20 years, many more females have gone to sea in command. And now every branch within the Navy is available and open to women. And we have some fantastic role models in all of those areas. Next slide, please. So after command, back into training, this time a year-long course to be a principal warfare officer. The principal warfare officer on board a frigate or destroyer fights the ship on behalf of the captain. I was responsible for the ship's weapon systems and sensors to be able to react to any threat to ourselves or any of the fleet or units that we will be protecting. I deployed for 8 months on board HMS Campbelltown. Our work consisted of operating on the east coast of Africa, but predominantly in the northern Arabian Gulf. Next slide, please. We were part of a multinational task group who were protecting the 2 Iraqi oil platforms. This was just at the end of the Second Gulf War, and the income from those platforms was vital to rebuilding the country. We were responsible for protecting those platforms for any threat from small boats or from shore-based missiles. And it was a really exciting time professionally, but also looking around at my sailors who were operating the upper deck weapon systems, who were manning the radars and the sensors, their professional pride to be the best that they could be on their piece of equipment to make the whole team work and have a fantastic operating warship will always fill me with such pride in my team. One memory I do have, though, that we all experienced on board, just to the north of our patrol area was a fishing ground. And in the daytime, the fishing vessels would go out, conduct their fishing, and come back to this fishing ground, and they would clean off their decks, washing all the fish guts and so forth into the water. Now, you may not know, but Navy warships make their own water. We take the seawater, we filter it, we clean it, and we use it. Now, we can filter it and clean it, but one thing we cannot do is take away the smell. So for the time we were operating in the Northern Gulf, every time we had a shower, it stank of fish. And every time we'd have a glass of water, it smelt and tasted of fish. One part of the patrols that we really didn't miss. Next slide, please. The following year, I deployed for another 12 months patrol, and I was part of a NATO battle staff, a headquarters in charge of a task group of ships. And we, in the first 6 months, operated on Italian ships, which was an incredible experience, fantastic food as well. And then in the second 6 months, moved across to HMS Cornwall, and the battle staff on there worked alongside other battle staffs who were deployed conducting counter-piracy. And the map that you can see in the top left shows the area of operations. We were working off the coast of Somalia through one of the busiest shipping lanes from any vessels going from Asia to Europe. You may well be aware that stretch is in the news at the moment. At the time, pirates would aim to get on board the merchant ships, overpower the crew, and then take that ship to an anchorage off the coast of Somalia. They would then demand ransoms from the big companies who would invariably pay them through insurance in order to get their ships and the crews back safely. The way we operated was the ships from a range of different nations, and this was quite incredible. We were working alongside Chinese, Russian, Indian, Gulf state ships, European ships, NATO nations. It was a fantastic international effort, and we effectively created a safe corridor for the ships to operate through. And then whenever there was a piracy alert, whoever was the nearest ship would then be sent to go and try and intercept those pirates. We were quite successful over that period of years. At the height, there were about 160 piracy incidents a year, but by 2016, this had really dropped down to barely any at all. Next slide, please. On completion of that, I returned to the UK and I was selected second in command of our newest Type 45 destroyer, initially HMS Duncan and then into HMS Defender. These ships were in build in the dockyards in Glasgow, and as second in command, my role not only to liaise with the dockyard, but fundamentally important was to bring together the first ship's company so that we could learn our ship, train together, and be ready to go to sea. And for this, again, the training and mentoring role I absolutely loved. And I remember bringing together sailors who had never been to sea before with those who had plenty of years of experience. But the one unique thing that we had that bonded us all was this was a brand new class of ship. Everybody had to learn the systems, had to learn their way around the ship so that we could operate it safely and effectively, ready to do our workup before going on deployment. Now, they do say that the reputation of a ship, whether it's a happy ship or a good ship, is established very early on in its life. And we were very aware that as the first ship's company, we would set the tone for how that ship would be going into its long career. And we were very keen to set up those traditions nice and early that would take it through its entire time, and a real privilege to be able to do that. Next slide, please. I have also worked in a number of operational headquarters, and the headquarters is effectively the battle staff. And one of the key roles that we will do as a battle staff is plan operations. The photos you can see here, I was in the amphibious battle staff in HMS Albion, operating off the coast of Norway and also the eastern seaboard of the United States. I have been on other battle staffs involved in operations of our high readiness ships around the UK and other activity further afield. Everything that is done, it has to be planned at the headquarters level. And one of the key parts of planning is to understand the situation. What are the military being asked to do? Come up with a number of potential courses of action and analyse these to find the one that has the most chance of success. We then refine this further and turn it into a plan and a set of orders to give out to our subordinate units. One of the biggest challenges is to be able to test that plan before it gets put into action. How do we find any potential failings and correct them before they get put into operation? And one way of doing that is looking at the problem from as many different perspectives as we can. A diversity of thought is really important in helping us to do that. And one time I experienced how essential this was when I was teaching the Advanced Command and Staff course at our UK Defence Academy. We had a course of 300 senior military officers, but from 50 different nations. You can imagine the different perspectives and diversity of thought from officers from Brazil to Singapore to Kenya to Estonia or to the UK, seeing how they interacted in the syndicate rooms, particularly during the planning exercises, was really enlightening and hugely important in understanding all the different perspectives, challenging each other's ideas in order to get the best possible plan. Next slide, please. And this is something I experience on a daily basis. My current job within the NATO Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, we are NATO's high readiness land component headquarters, and with a cross-section of NATO officers serving together, that ability to challenge each other's plan in order to come up with the best possible options is absolutely valid and part of the job that I really enjoy. So for all the challenges of my naval career, it is perhaps our decision to adopt our two boys in 2015 that has challenged us the most. The Royal Navy has taught me resilience, how to work and live with others. It has taught me a great deal about training and mentoring, adjusting how I train in order to get the best out of individuals so that they can be the best that they can be. I believe that in parenting our boys, we have had to prioritise their complex needs. We have had to learn how to parent, how to change our decisions, our career paths at times, in order to allow them to have the best opportunity for success. I hope that as a parent, I am able to provide them that safe and loving environment so that they can also have big dreams and we can help them along every step of the way. I hope that they would be able to optimise the amazing opportunities that are out there, just as my parents once did for me. Looking back over my 30 years of naval career, there are some key principles which I believe are not only valid within the military, but also in all walks of life. And I would like to share 3 of those with you now. First of all, we must encourage our young people to dream big. But importantly, we must support them all the way along their way so that they can realise those dreams. Secondly, teamwork. A team where individuals feel empowered and valued will always have the best results and be the most effective team. And finally, diversity of thought. The best decisions come when we consider a problem from all perspectives. We need to embrace challenge. We need to challenge our own beliefs. We need to be curious of other people's perspectives and accept their challenge. We need to identify and embrace the differences that we have, but equally identify those common goals that bring us all together. I would like to hand back to Derek for some questions before I will leave you on one final naval story. Derek.
Commander Yemm, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. We've had some fantastic people on Monday Night Live, and you're right up there at the top and absolutely different, but so many messages. Now we've got some lifelong learners, a lot of lifelong learners on. People have been involved in training and personal development. Some of the things that you said really hit home. You talked about clear thinking. I imagine when you're under attack or whatever's happening, or there's something dodgy on the radar in my language, how do you do that clear thinking? Because so many people don't have clear thinking at the moment, as far as I can see.
I believe that the way to have that clear thinking, that clarity of thought, is fundamentally based on how we train our people. When our training is good, repetitive, invariably, what the training is doing is making sure that we know exactly how to go almost onto autopilot. So the basics just happen, a bit like being on train tracks. You just know where you're going because you have trained for it. What that does is it frees up that spare capacity in our brains to think about the what next, what happens when we get there. And that's the bit that training is absolutely vital for. So having that spare capacity to stay calm and think about what next is fundamentally based on staying on those train tracks through the heat of the moment.
And how much repetition actually happens? I imagine a huge amount.
We do, absolutely. If you take emergencies such as fires on board the ship, floods, damage control, any of those, they're trained weekly, daily, sometimes at sea. So not only just throughout training, and we have some fantastic training facilities where we can put people into simulators where they can extinguish fires. And we also have our damage repair unit, which is a mock-up of a ship, and we fill it with water and we rock it from side to side, and we get the teams to fill the holes to stop the water piling in, and then we shore it up with bits of wood. So we can train that shore side, but also when we go to sea, the teams will train regularly on board because we need to know every square inch of our ship. So whenever there is emergency, we can respond to it.
Wow. And I've made 8 pages of notes here. I'm a serial note taker, but professional pride to be the very best you ever can be. I thought that was fantastic. And that's just ingrained into the Royal Navy?
I believe so. Absolutely. The classic Navy advert, born somewhere and made in the Royal Navy, I think that's very valid. I do think it shapes us in how we want to be And with good role models and good leaders, that is definitely the best way to bring out the best in people.
You made me laugh about a happy ship. Is that true? When we rehearsed this, you said even when the first crews left, if it was set up as a happy ship in the very first time, it seemed to carry on. Is that true?
Well, when we don't just leave as a whole team, we have a slow trickle of new people coming in and changing over. So fundamentally, if you can set up the right routines and if you can set up the right traditions, one example, in the wardroom, we decided to get tankards for every officer's position in that wardroom, even if they hadn't yet joined. And we engraved the names of the first officer, and then when they handed over, the next officer. And I would love to see now those tankards have probably got 10, 12 names on them, and they will be able to look back, and some of those names will have gone on to great places in the Navy. So I think that's the way that you bring that team spirit together.
Final question before I hand over. You don't know that I'm going to ask you that, but what was the most exciting thing and learning point that happened in your long career?
Most exciting? Well, interestingly, I'm probably about to tell you a story which I hope will answer one of those examples.
Fantastic.
So if you would let me, I will share that with everyone now.
I will. Thank you.
Next slide, please. I was a navigating officer on board HMS Herald. We were on hydrographic survey operations in the Mediterranean. I had the middle watch. The middle watch is between midnight and 4 in the morning. And a storm had blown up in the Mediterranean. And in the Mediterranean, the sea state gets quite choppy and quite fierce. And we had decided it was out of limits for survey operations. We brought the kit in and were going to just batten down the hatches and see out the night. However, as I had finished securing the ship, I looked out and in the distance I could see a red flare. And then very shortly after, the chatter from our emergency beacon system on the bridge indicated that there was a ship not too far away from us, which was in difficulty. I reported it to the captain and we proceeded to where the flare had come from to see what the situation was and what we could do. As we were heading in that direction, the weather conditions continued to deteriorate. The rain was driving and it was very hard to see out. When we got to the location, we could identify a small ferry that was unlit and listing in the water. We managed to establish communications with the crew on the bridge, and they told us that they were a ferry on the return journey, so they didn't have passengers, but they had their crew. They had a damage in the engine rooms and they had lost all power and they were taking in water. The crew were very scared and were very grateful that we were on scene. Unfortunately, the weather was so poor that we could barely see the ship, when it was certainly too rough to try and put a seaboat in the water to go and rescue the crew from their ship. So we called for the RAF search and rescue helicopter, which was based in Cyprus, some 80 miles away. And as we were waiting for the helicopter, we continued to circle the ferry, keeping a close eye, talking to them on the bridge and trying to reassure them that help was on the way. We got our flight deck ready, not that the helicopter had a chance of landing on it, but just in case any winching operations were required. But the deck was pitching and rolling, so it was quite dangerous. We had a crackle of the radio and a last communications from the crew. They told us that it was too dangerous and they needed to abandon ship as their ship was sinking. They got off the ship into their life rafts. Now, it had been hard enough to keep an eye on the ship that was sinking in front of us, but trying to keep an eye on the small life raft with the crew on was even harder, but our lookouts were doing an incredible job. Thankfully, the helicopter arrived just at that time, and we spoke to them and explained the situation and said the crew were now in the life raft. The helicopter said that they couldn't take the whole crew back to Cyprus with them because it would be too heavy and the conditions were too poor. But they decided they would be able to winch them onto our deck. A very dangerous evolution. Our crew were there with their earthing strops as the crew were being lifted out of the life raft and then put onto the flight deck of our ship. And this went on for about half an hour. However, you can imagine the immense relief on the face of the ship's captain when he realised that all of his crew were accounted for. We took them inside the ship and we treated them for hypothermia, and we sailed back towards their home in Cyprus, and we arrived there the following afternoon. I was up on the bridge wing and I was looking down at my ship's company who were along the bridge and down on the upper deck. We were looking across onto the jetty, seeing the families waiting there for them and seeing the crew going ashore, and the emotional reunion was quite something. This was December and just before Christmas. And I remember a huge sense of pride looking at my ship's company, and I could see it in their faces. They also knew that that night we had saved their lives. We had made a big difference, and those families would be together that Christmas.
Wow, what a fantastic story to end with. Commander Yemm, can I thank you so much for joining Monday Night Live, and can I ask all members of Monday Night Live to thank you in the normal way? Thank you so much, and perhaps you would join us in a few months' time again to tell us on your exciting appointment as a captain at the training base. And I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you again, and I'll open it up to questions once the recording's finished. Thank you so much, and it was a pleasure, absolutely fantastic. And thanks to Patricia for working the slide deck.